cloud. Yes, I'd just like to thank Dr. Amanda White for coming in to present to us on, if I'm not mistaken, Amanda, on accounting and the Indigenous experience, yes?
Yes.
And so all I'm going to do is, I had the pleasure down in San Diego at the AAA, the American Accounting Association conference, of hearing parts of this, if not significant amounts. And the only thing I can think is, all of you here in this forum needed to hear what she had to say. It was just really, really good. So without ado, I'll pass it on to you, Amanda. I'm also going to give you rights for any PowerPoints. I'm going to do that now. So
perfect. Perfect. Excellent. So I want to thank everybody for coming along. And if it's week one where you are, geez, I can understand how busy you are, because that was me 4 weeks ago. We're into week 4 here at my university. And as a bit of an introduction, I'm, I guess, what we call teaching track here in Australia as a bit of an equivalent. And I'm a senior lecturer. And I've been teaching accounting for 20 years now. I hate, I feel so old when I say teaching accounting for 20 years. And I taught third year for probably 15 or 16 of those. And then just at the end of last year, beginning of our academic year for 2022, my boss said, hey, would you like to take on the challenge of first year accounting? And so that's what I'm doing, and new curriculum. So I'm having some great adventures in that space. So today I'm going to share my presentation from the Conference on Teaching and Learning in Accounting, which is about introducing Indigenous and other perspectives of accounting into your curriculum. Of course, I'd like to start my presentation, as we typically and traditionally do here in Australia, acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional lands and caretakers of the land and waterways on which UTS, my university, now stands. And I'd like to also acknowledge the Darug people on whose land I live and work, and I'm streaming into you from today. And I'd also like to pay respect to elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. Of course, for Erin, I know that she'll be used to this type of acknowledgement, but in the US, for CTLA, I also did a land acknowledgement that I customized by doing my research on the people who were the traditional or native tribes of San Diego. And I know that it can be quite contentious as to whether you do or don't do a land acknowledgement, but I know that at CTLA, I was surprised to be the only presenter who actually included a land acknowledgement as part of my presentation. I'll also keep an eye on the chat as well while I'm presenting. So when we think about accounting, when you look at textbooks about accounting, there is almost always this picture, which is Pacioli, and I'm not sure who the other person is in the picture. I have a feeling it might be the artist or the painter, but in 1494 AD, this is what we think of as accounting and the origins of accounting. And you read any textbook and it talks about double entry bookkeeping and Pacioli being the father of modern accounting. And for most of our students, this is their first exposure when they're reading textbooks. But for students of Indigenous heritage, for non-European, non-Western backgrounds that are in our classes, when I was taking over first year, I thought, well, how does this lack of representation affect their perceptions of accounting and their willingness to engage? Lots of students engage in accounting because they see it as a stable career. It's a great career for financial security that'll allow them to go on to executive roles within business. But they weren't really looking at accounting and saying, oh, I can identify with the heritage of this. It's, well, I'm conforming and adopting to this Western perspective. And so when I took on first year and my university said, look, we're starting to what we call indigenize our curriculum, introduce Indigenous perspectives into everything that we teach, whether that's business, nursing, law, science, and technology. So I thought, okay, if I'm going to introduce Indigenous perspectives, let's also, which is the oldest continuing culture that we have in the world, I thought, well, okay, as an Asian, Chinese is my heritage. Did we have some form of accounting? And so that got me thinking about how I could expand diversity, equity, and inclusion to include these other perspectives. And so, of course, like any good teacher, I did a whole lot of internet searching. And I thought, oh, what can I find? And I just realized I forgot to press the button. And so if you go back to ancient Mesopotamia, then there is records related to numeracy and counting. And if you go into a lot of the accounting history journals, and thank you to Erin, because I asked Erin for some advice on journals of where I would be looking for certain things, that there's this possibility that even text came from accounting, and the idea that we had numbers to represent things and centralized economies where we needed to keep track of everything and trade. So there's evidence of accounting in ancient Mesopotamia. And so all of my students, when I show them this and I have a very wide variety of students, a lot of my Persian and Middle Eastern students, like, hang on, we have something to do with accounting? They thought that was quite exciting. And then we also have a large population of Chinese and Asian international students in our courses. And I found a paper that I shared with my students about Chinese accounting and auditing, about numerical literacy. And again, Chinese students were like, wow, okay, all right, well, we're learning this Western perspective, but we also had our own versions of accounting that have been incorporated. And, we talk about cultural competence. Those histories of accounting affect how they interpret accounting today. And then in preparation for going to the AAA, I have virtually no students from the African continent in our classes. So they weren't a big population. So I didn't think about them from a representation perspective when we were preparing my materials, but I did in preparation for CTLA. And I found this particular piece about the evolution of accountancy to accountability in Africa. Again, the cradle of civilization, and not acknowledging these in our accounting texts is really, for a lot of students, not showing them where accounting comes from and the impact that their cultural background that they have some linkage back to accounting, because we want students to be able to see what they could become. Just hang on one moment. Sorry, I have my other son in the room with me as well, so just checking on him. So I wanted to start my journey of Indigenous self-education, and that came about because the university mandated an Indigenous graduate attribute, or essentially a course intended, degree intended learning outcome that everybody needed to incorporate. And nobody else wanted to incorporate Indigenous perspective. So I said, hey, I'm brave. I'm up for it. Let's learn something new. And for me, this is a strong part of what most organizations would call as an Indigenous reconciliation plan of moving forward, and Indigenous acknowledgement. But I got the questions of where do I start, who do I ask, and what is appropriate to ask? Because the research shows that Australian Indigenous leaders in universities are extremely overworked. And I'm sure the research into minority leaders in the United States would show the same, that minority leaders are extremely overworked because they're expected to do their own role. And that minority could be based on race, based on gender. It seems like women put their hands up for service and university community roles a lot more than my male colleagues. And I know that those things that are often not strategically important to promotion, but important for student learning, important for the university community. So Australian Indigenous leaders are extremely overworked in universities, and I didn't want to contribute to that by knocking on their door and asking a million questions. that people had asked before. So I didn't know where to start. I knew sort of sometimes who to ask, but not really. And then I thought, oh, we have this Australian television show called You Can't Ask That, where you sometimes think, oh, is it appropriate to ask this person that particular question? Just like you probably never should ask a woman, oh, are you pregnant? In looking at them physically. And especially when that woman says no, because that's happened to me. I've just had a big lunch. But what is appropriate to ask about how to introduce Indigenous perspectives? And what if I offend somebody and I step on the wrong toes? So I was really worried about making a misstep. And that was, it was just this thing that resulted for me in paralysis due to analysis. I got into my head, scared to make a mistake or misstep or offend someone, especially because all of our learning materials are pre-recorded. So anything I make in regards to introducing Indigenous perspectives is pre-recorded and immortalized on video. And I was concerned about cancel culture. So if I say the wrong thing and I make an idiot of myself and a student records it, then they put it on TikTok, what is going to happen to me? And so I just ended up frozen in this space for a really long time until I spoke to a Indigenous colleague who's like, Amanda, just make the mistake or just, give it a go, was what they encouraged. So my advice, if you're also feeling like you want to do something in this area, but you're a bit stuck, my university now has an Indigenous liaison unit where we can go for advice. At the beginning of the year when I started this, there wasn't that. There was just some web resources. So I was searching around. In the United States, I know that there's tribal liaison units at some universities. My diversity, equity, and inclusion unit, I discovered had a whole treasure trove of resources that helped, but they weren't referenced anywhere. So it was only because I was looking on a DEI site in relation to something to support my LGBTQ students. And here in Australia, it's Friday. So I'm wearing purple because it is Wear a Purple Day, which is our day to support LGBTIQA plus youth. But I stumbled across information from them. My central learning and teaching unit were not that helpful. Again, they pointed us towards an Indigenous unit of staff who were also overworked. But then I also discovered that my library had curated a whole lot of resources. And again, our issue was that we didn't have one place to find all this information or that referenced all this information. So it took a little bit of digging and asking the right people. And I teach a subject that has 1,600 in its large session, which would be your fall. And my autumn session is our intake. And then in my second session, right now I only have about 500, so it's smaller, but I also have anywhere between 5 and 25 teaching assistants. And for them, they were just, oh, Amanda, I'm not sure about teaching this. I feel a bit uncomfortable. And so we've taken a bit of a staged approach across our workshops, which is our large activities with 350 students in each of them, run multiple times, and our tutorials, which are smaller activities that only have 25 students. And so in our smaller activities where I have tutors or TAs who are less experienced, feel less confident in their knowledge in this area. And look, to be honest, there's also different options around training and resources. But as a TA, they don't have a lot of time. And as a full-time academic, I don't have a lot of time to attend those as well. So the easiest point is acknowledgement of the traditional owners or land acknowledgement. And for some of my tutors, they feel really comfortable in saying this every week. And for others, they just start with having that slide up. And we use a map also that shows which land we're on and the lands surrounding us. So that's our easiest starting point that's eased our tutors into these roles. Sometimes our students who are Indigenous do identify to us. Other times they choose to keep that private, that information private, which is absolutely fine. But the feedback that we get is from Indigenous students that comes in anonymously is that they appreciate seeing this every single week, even if we don't say it. Oh, clicking. Okay. One of the traps I fell into early on in writing my material and figuring out what to do is that I fell into what we call the deficit model, that accounting has been used to the detriment of Indigenous and Native peoples and minorities over thousands of years. And that included, when I was doing my research, recording of Indigenous peoples as assets or capital. So I was reading a story, funnily enough, from Instagram that I included in my materials, where someone was trying to trace their family ancestry and they ran out of luck in birth records. And the local historian in the country town that they were in New South Wales said, oh, no, you don't need to look in birth records for records of Indigenous peoples back then. What you need to look on is the register of sheep and cattle, because that's how people were treated. And so that was really quite shocking for me to figure out. I thought, okay, well, I needed to talk about some of the ugly truths that came through around slavery, around control of resources, around land rights and custodians and caretakers versus the owners of the land. And we acknowledge, and it depends on your university and how your acknowledgement is phrased, but we also acknowledge in many instances that land was never ceded from Indigenous peoples. Now, there's a great question in the chat that I just saw about the feedback from non-Indigenous students. And I think that what we're seeing is, for students where this is the first time they might be exposed to this in university, the way that we're doing it is actually quite interesting, and they're interested to understand different perspectives, because they recognize that Indigenous people are the traditional owners of the lands of which all of our businesses operate. We have some students who feel like this is just a virtue signaling exercise, and that by doing an acknowledgement of country, that's just a signaling device. But then once we back that up with more integrated activities within our classroom, they sort of get on board with that. And then, of course, we still have, we do have some students, and it's almost always young men who have probably had a bit more of a sheltered high school life, who do give us feedback. Why should I care about these people and these perspectives? They're also very likely the students who are telling me in anonymous Mentimeter polls in our classes that the person that's probably likely to give them the best advice on how to achieve success in their life, we ask students for inspirational heroes, is controversial figure who's just been banned off Facebook and Instagram, Andrew Tate. So I don't necessarily put a lot of stock in some of the comments that do come through, because it's normalizing these types of conversations. And we're seeing a lot more of the integration of this content in high schools. And as those students start to come through into our university system, hopefully that increases the awareness. So I had sort of started with all of these, the deficit model of just talking about all of the terrible things that had happened. Something that I hadn't done, but I just want to make people aware of, is the risk of spotlighting Indigenous students without their consent. So if students have reached out to me, yes, honey? Is that what you want to take today for the biscuits? That's fine. Just put them in a container, please. Oh, okay. Put them in whatever the container is with the other biscuits. I'm sure we've done all of this during COVID, taught entire classes holding children on my lap. So whenever an Indigenous student does share with me, and if I'm keen to include their perspectives, I always ask them privately of, if you're, would you be interested in sharing this with the class? Would you feel safe and secure in doing that? Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. And there was a question about how many Indigenous students do you have on average in your class? In my cohort of 1,600, I believe I had 20 students who had identified with me, and there's potentially more. What we do have, Indigenous participation rates in Australian university are very low. So less than 3% of our populations typically are Indigenous students, even less so in business, because our Indigenous students tend to gravitate towards education and medical science or health science types of fields. And Erin will know this, trying to attract Indigenous students into accounting, where they see it as boring and dry, and they're not quite sure how that's going to help them and their people to thrive, can be really difficult. So that's another bigger project that's happening across Australian universities. I had to be very careful about focusing on overly colonialist perspectives and white savior narratives. I had been working with some colleagues, and they said, oh, well, but we should feature about how accounting has made their lives better in all these other different ways. I said, oh, but better from your perspective, that might not be from theirs. And expecting Indigenous and minority scholars to teach us. So we were at Australia's largest higher education conference. One of our most prominent Indigenous researchers, and essentially a vice president Indigenous at her university, had given us all the statistics about how overworked Indigenous and minority scholars were. And an older white gentleman had said, well, if you want us to change, you should teach us what to do. Yes, honey. Okay, are you going to speak up? Okay, what can I help you with? Nothing. Do you just want to come and have a hug and sit on my lap? Okay, you have to be quiet, all right? I'm going to lower the chair a bit so that we both fit. So again, it was this idea of, if you want us to introduce your perspectives, don't use your PhD and your knowledge of research and research skills to do this for yourself. Where quite often, and I experience this with a lot of my colleagues, they say, well, look, our Indigenous liaison should give us the resources and all the packages and information, and they're really asking to be spoon-fed. And we are professional researchers. We have those skills to be able to read books and delve into the research. And if they're keen to share with us, that's great, but we should never expect that we are entitled to their knowledge and to their skills. And so the other side of the deficit model is that it's critical to show examples of self-determination. So a lot of our examples are Indigenous businesses, not just from the financial and the accounting perspective, but then also from the perspective of business as a social enterprise, and these businesses really using their knowledge of Western business and accounting, and then adapting that and making that suit what they need. So we've been focusing on activities that have been done to close the gap. Oh, I think he wants to stay with me. Oh no, he's willing to go to Dad. Flexibility is always the key. To what we call close the gap, experienced by Indigenous peoples and other minorities, and how they're taking control and driving the future using accounting in their way. And for us, that's been really critical. For us, it's also been a process of collaboration where we have that whole phrase of nothing about us without us. And so again, but we're being wary of overburdening Indigenous scholars and leaders. But the call to action that we've had, I guess, across Australia is increase the number of Indigenous scholars referenced in your materials, whether that's research or teaching, including their references in your works. I've reached out to our local Indigenous Business Council, and they've been really fantastic in we're still the early stages, but liaising with potential speakers, and I'm putting together a proposal, and I've reached out to other academics who are starting to work in this space in Australia, and Erin will know CPA Australia. It's sort of one of our professional bodies equivalent to AICPA, and I'm taking to their Indigenous advisory group, hopefully soon, a proposal to build a national curriculum of resources that our accounting academics can use. So our Alumni Relations Office can be really helpful in sourcing guests who might come in and talk about their work and their careers to, again, be able to model for Indigenous students that careers in business and careers in accounting can have great benefit. And consider making any resources that you create available for reuse through Creative Commons license. I know that there's a lot of great work going on at different universities across Australia, but I found that when I approached a lot of people, oh, could we reuse that? Oh, no, that's been made just for our university and we're only using it here and we're unwilling to share with anybody else. So my project moving forward, hopefully with CPA Australia, is all of this resource will be available as Creative Commons so that people can use that resource, but it'll be under a no derivatives license, which means people can't adjust or change it in any way. Oh, and thank you, Erin. I'll get in touch with you because yes, there's some work going on at UNSW and I've been in touch with people at Charles Darwin University as well. So the things that we've been doing in our classrooms, in our learning materials, again, I'm acknowledging to students that I'm learning just like students in this area. I've asked students to consider their own cultural background. So when we start, we say, okay, consider your cultural background. I want you to do a Google search on the earliest information you can find about numeracy and trading in your cultural background, whether that's Turkish, Chinese, Malaysian, Indonesian, Egyptian, what can you find? And to share those ideas. And that gets students really excited of, oh, actually, my cultural background does have something to do with accounting. And then I ask students also to find the traditional owners or custodians of the land on which they live. And for Chinese international students, especially, they're like, hang on, does this matter? You know, they have a very specific perspective. And I ask them, well, look, is it different people from different regions of China? So we sort of adapt the question a little bit. But what is really great, especially when we're online and we have a lot of remote students, is that they've never looked at the map of the Indigenous nations map of Australia. So that really, again, gives them that exposure. And it's not just telling them information, but it's getting them to search for information as well. With help for your diversity, equity and inclusion office, most of them have training on how to be a good ally. And that good ally training, typically, you know, it's the same similar types of training for Indigenous perspectives, as well as related to diversity, equity and inclusion more generally. Around inappropriate language or perceptions, and then providing support to affected colleagues or peers. So I don't have any Indigenous colleagues that work in my space, but when students are using inappropriate language and behavior when we're talking about these, it's been really important for me to say something about that. And typically it's comments that are done anonymously. I have such large cohorts of 350 that we use Mentimeter a lot. And we talk to students about how to call out inappropriate behavior, whether that's in discussion about Indigenous perspectives, whether that's, I was asked in an anonymous Mentimeter in the first week around, and it was just a comment box. So the comments were just sort of scrolling through, but asked for my OnlyFans account. Amanda, what is your OnlyFans account? And at first I didn't know what that was. Well, I just said, Amanda, what is your OF account? And I didn't know what that meant until a student was like, Amanda, what is this? One of my students said that's what it was. I teach the subject when we have a large cohort with a male colleague. And we've worked together for a number of different years. We're friends outside of work. Students had asked, or a student had asked on that same poll whether we were sleeping together, in not so nice words, of course, using other profanities. And so the very first time that had ever happened to me, I was like, I'm just going to skip on to the next slide. You just get so shocked that you just skip over. But then when I went back and I thought, okay, you know, my students actually came up and were great allies first and said, Amanda, are you okay? Like, that was really inappropriate. And I said, oh, look, I'm fine. And I just was like, it's the first week. We just got to get through the class. But then as I started to think about this more, I'm like, well, you know, This is students who have been in home high school for 2 years. They're poorly socialized is what I like to think, of having been in their little home bubbles. So I thought, I need to do something about this. And so again, the training we give students on being a good ally, on calling out inappropriate behavior and language and perceptions when it comes to anything diversity, equity, and inclusion related, is we share with students about how normalizing inappropriate behavior, whether that's speech like I experienced, whether that's misogyny, other different things, calling that out is really critical to signal to others that this is inappropriate behavior, and that we don't want to normalize that inappropriate behavior, because that just leads to worse and worse in terms of spiraling. So we talk to our students about calling out, how you publicly call out. And a lot of students did want to say something, but they weren't sure how. So we actually provide students with scripts of things you can say, and we get them to practice with each other. That's not cool. Like, is it okay to say that's not cool? Yeah, that's a great start, versus calling in. Whereas if it's a friend and it's happening in a friend group situation, you might not want to embarrass your friend in front of everybody else, but you might sort of pull them aside and say, yeah, as part of calling in, I didn't think that was very funny. Or can you tell me why you thought that was funny? Because I didn't think that that was cool. And then we also teach our students to provide support to affected colleagues and peers by asking them, are you okay? Can I provide you with support? What's this? Oh, I think ask Daddy if you can have some nose spray. They're having some trouble. You've never had nose spray, but you could try it. Now, mistakes and missteps are inevitable. And, I'm sure when we first started teaching accounting, I was so worried about making a mistake that just sort of made sure that every week my class followed a very specific plan and there was no room for wiggle room. But again, we're taking an approach of co-creation with students and students as partners and getting involved. So the first thing whenever I make a mistake, or a student might say, oh, look, Amanda, I'm not sure about that, is I acknowledge that. I'm honest in what I've learned. So I say, look, originally, this was my perspective. And this was the reason why I wanted to share this presentation at CTLA, was because I know that other people might be in the same boat of, I'm trying to make changes, but I don't want to make a mistake. And I want it to be perfect the first time it goes out the door. But in this space, as it's evolving, we are going to learn so much as we go. So being honest in what I've learned and where I've come from, actively committing to do better in the future, and then collaborating with our students and with our Indigenous units has been really critical, and inviting students to co-create and get involved. I haven't had any students take me up on this, but the offer it's there in all my learning materials of, if you're an Indigenous student and you'd like to contribute to this perspective, here are different ways that you might be able to do that and get in touch with me. But so far, nobody has actually taken me up on that, but it's only been one semester and a tiny bit. So hopefully that'll improve as we go on. Yeah, an inter-institutional working group, as Erin mentioned, is something that is on my plans of things that I'm preparing. And the Accounting and Finance Association of Australia and New Zealand, hopefully we can drive some of this as well through our main academic professional body similar to AAA. So that's all I have. And I want to thank Anton. I have AirPods Pro, but I swear they don't like my ears, for inviting me today. I'll also drop my LinkedIn link in the comments as well. But I'm happy to continue this conversation now. So I'm going to end my slideshow and looking forward to having a chat.
I would just like to say, Dr. Amanda White, for newcomers here, what a pleasure it has been to hear you speak about this subject once again. You're engaging, you're brilliant. You're frankly shaming me as an academic and parent, the way you handle it. You're just absolutely fantastic. Okay, that's just
look. It's early in the morning at the end of the day after they've asked me something 20 times. I might be a bit like, But my kids have learned how to get away with stuff. In my evening classes, they come in like, Mum, can I have more iPad time in front of my entire class? And the students are like, go on, miss, do it, don't be a bad parent.
And again, yes, I mean, do you know what? You handle it brilliantly. I can barely speak in the morning. So I will say, I'm just going to stop recording now as well.